The American Revolution was written before it was fought, printed before it was declared, and argued in taverns and coffeehouses long before muskets fired at Lexington Green. The real battlefield was not Bunker Hill or Yorktown, but the pages of pamphlets, broadsides, and newspapers that flooded colonial cities with arguments so powerful they transformed subjects into citizens and grievances into revolution. Writers like Thomas Paine wielded words as weapons more devastating than any cannon, crafting prose that made independence seem not just possible but inevitable, not just desirable but morally necessary for any people who valued liberty over submission to tyranny that wore the mask of legitimate authority. Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, sold more than 100,000 copies within months in colonies with a population of only 2.5 million, reaching an audience that extended far beyond the educated elite to include farmers, artisans, and labourers who heard it read aloud in taverns and meeting houses where ordinary people gathered to debate the political crisis that would determine their futures. Paine wrote in plain language that bypassed the learned constitutional arguments of lawyers and philosophers, speaking directly to common understanding of justice and self-interest, with arguments so clear and compelling that readers who had never questioned monarchy suddenly saw it as absurd relic of superstition rather than divinely ordained order. Benjamin Edis ran the Boston Gazette from a print shop that became headquarters for the Sons of Liberty, churning out inflammatory articles and reports of British abuses that shaped colonial perception of imperial policy and gave radical resistance the appearance of mainstream sentiment through constant repetition of grievances and provocations that might otherwise have been forgotten or minimized. His press made revolution seem not like radical innovation but like inevitable response to British tyranny that every reasonable person should support. Mary Catherine Goddard operated the Maryland Journal and would later print the first official copies of the Declaration with all signers' names attached, risking destruction of her press and imprisonment for publishing what British authorities considered treasonous sedition. These printers understood that print culture could create political reality by making certain ideas seem universal and certain conclusions seem inescapable through sheer repetition and ubiquity of revolutionary arguments that saturated colonial discourse until alternatives to independence appeared cowardly or foolish rather than prudent or loyal. The American Revolution moved at the speed of horseback, carried by riders who galloped through rain and darkness to deliver messages that held colonies together when distance and poor communication threatened to fragment resistance into isolated provincial protests that Britain could suppress, one at a time. These midnight couriers were the nervous system of revolution, connecting committees and assemblies separated by hundreds of miles of rough roads, carrying news of British movements and colonial responses that allowed patriots to coordinate resistance and present unified front against imperial authority that sought to divide and conquer rebellious provinces. Paul Revere's midnight ride became legendary, but he was merely the most famous of hundreds of express riders who risked their lives carrying intelligence and correspondence through territory controlled by British forces or populated by loyalists who would have gladly captured patriot messengers and delivered them to royal authorities for punishment. Israel Bissell rode from Watertown to Philadelphia, covering more than 350 miles in less than 5 days after Lexington and Concord, spreading alarm that British troops had fired on militia and that war had begun, whether anyone was ready for it or not. His endurance and determination exemplified the commitment required of riders who understood that delayed messages could mean military disaster or political fragmentation. The express networks that developed between 1774 and 1776 created communication infrastructure that made coordinated colonial resistance possible, despite distances that would have isolated each province in earlier decades, when royal posts controlled mail and censored seditious correspondence. Committees of correspondence established relay systems where fresh horses and riders waited at predetermined stations, allowing urgent messages to move continuously rather than depending on single exhausted courier to cover impossible distances. These networks operated underground, using code words and trusted contacts to avoid British surveillance and loyalist informers who would have reported patriot communications to authorities seeking to disrupt rebel coordination. The riders who carried revolution's messages through hostile territory deserve recognition alongside the writers who crafted those messages and the leaders who acted on the intelligence they contained, because without these couriers risking capture and worse to deliver letters and resolutions across enemy lines, the 13 colonies would have remained 13 separate rebellions rather than united movement that could sustain organized resistance against British military power that sought to crush resistance before it could coalesce into genuine threat to imperial control. Women powered the American Revolution from positions that official histories ignored for centuries, organizing the boycotts that made British trade policy unsustainable, gathering intelligence that gave Washington's army crucial advantages, and maintaining farms and businesses while men fought, enabling the colonial economy to survive years of warfare that would have collapsed without their labor and management. The Daughters of Liberty transformed consumer choices into political statements, pledging to forswear British goods and produce homespun cloth rather than import textiles from mills in Manchester, turning spinning wheels into symbols of resistance as effective as muskets, in demonstrating colonial determination to achieve self-governance, regardless of economic cost. Abigail Adams managed the family farm in Massachusetts, while John Adams served in Congress in Philadelphia, making financial decisions, supervising workers, and raising children alone for years at a stretch, while sending her husband letters filled with political analysis that shaped his thinking on questions of governance and liberty. Her famous admonition to remember the ladies when crafting new laws for the independent nation demonstrated that women understood how revolutionary rhetoric about natural rights and consent of the governed applied to their own subordination within patriarchal structures that denied them legal existence separate from fathers and husbands. Though the founders ignored her warning, she articulated principles that would eventually transform American society long after the Revolution's military victory was secure. Mercy Otis Warren wrote plays and poems that satirized British officials and loyalist sympathizers with wit sharp enough to draw blood, using literature as political weapon to shape colonial opinion about the conflict's moral stakes and the character of those who opposed independence or supported continued submission to parliamentary authority. Her work circulated widely in manuscript and print, influencing educated colonists who valued literary merit alongside political argument, and demonstrating that women's intellectual contributions to revolutionary cause extended far beyond domestic support, roles that later generations would emphasize while minimizing their political agency and influence. Anonymous women throughout the colonies participated in crowd actions, protected patriot leaders from arrest, smuggled supplies past British lines, and performed countless acts of resistance that left no names in historical records but collectively made organized rebellion possible by creating networks of support that sustained revolutionary movement through years when victory seemed unlikely and defeat would have meant harsh punishment for all who had supported independence against legitimate authority of Crown and Parliament. The Committees of Correspondence invented shadow government before anyone called it that, creating political structures that operated parallel to royal administration and gradually displaced it by assuming functions that legitimate government could no longer perform effectively once colonists refused to recognize its authority. Samuel Adams orchestrated the committee system from Boston with political genius that transformed local grievances into coordinated colonial resistance, understanding that isolated protests would fail, but unified movement could challenge imperial power if patriots could communicate effectively and coordinate their actions across provincial boundaries. The committees began modestly in 1772 as Boston's response to British threats against colonial self-government, intended merely to correspond with other Massachusetts towns about common concerns and coordinate responses to imperial policies that affected all Bay Colony residents. Within months, the concept spread to other provinces as patriot leaders recognized the potential for intercolonial coordination that could bypass royal governors and customs officials who reported to London rather than to the people they ostensibly governed. By 1774, committees existed in virtually every colony, creating communication network that connected patriot leadership from New Hampshire to Georgia in ways that had never existed before, and that British authorities could not control or suppress. These committees coordinated more than correspondence, despite their name. They organized boycotts by publishing names of merchants who violated non-importation agreements, shaming them into compliance through social pressure that proved more effective than legal sanctions that royal courts would never have imposed against loyalist traders. They gathered intelligence on British troop movements and loyalist activities, creating a surveillance network that gave patriots crucial advantages in political and military struggles for control of colonial governance. They distributed propaganda by coordinating publication and circulation of pamphlets, broadsides, and newspaper articles that shaped colonial opinion and made patriot positions seem like common sense rather than radical innovation. The committees became the first government of independent America before independence was declared, assuming powers that traditionally belonged to royal administration and exercising authority derived not from crown appointment, but from popular support within communities that recognized committee legitimacy, even while officially remaining British subjects. This parallel government structure made the transition to independence organizationally feasible because patriots already possessed infrastructure for governance when formal break with Britain eliminated royal officials and left vacuum that committees could fill without triggering administrative collapse that might have doomed the revolution to failure before it properly began. Revolution required secrets, and secrets required spies, ordinary citizens who betrayed no outward sign of rebellion while gathering intelligence that gave patriots crucial advantages against British forces that commanded superior numbers, training, and equipment, but operated in hostile territory where every tavern, keeper, servant, and merchant might be reporting their movements and plans to Washington's intelligence networks. The spy networks that operated in occupied cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia during the war had their origins in pre-war surveillance systems that committees of correspondence established to monitor British officials and loyalist sympathizers in the escalating political crisis that preceded open military conflict. Boston's Patriot Network included tavern keepers who recorded conversations of British officers drinking in their establishments, servants in loyalist households who reported private discussions between royal officials, and merchants who noted which ships arrived with military supplies and how those supplies moved from docks to British garrison stores. These spies operated in plain sight, their occupations providing perfect cover for intelligence gathering because their presence in certain locations aroused no suspicion from British authorities who never imagined that colonists they considered simple provincials could operate sophisticated espionage operations that rivaled anything European powers deployed against each other in their endless wars for continental dominance. Women proved particularly effective spies because British officers and loyalist officials dismissed them as incapable of understanding military or political matters, speaking freely in their presence about plans and movements that those women then reported to Patriot handlers who compiled intelligence that gave Washington understanding of British intentions that he could never have achieved through military reconnaissance alone. Anna Smith Strong used her clothesline to signal Abraham Woodhull about British movements on Long Island, hanging laundry in patterns that conveyed coded messages to Culper Ring operatives who reported to Washington's headquarters. Her domestic routine provided perfect cover for espionage that British observers never suspected, even when they saw the signals displayed openly in her yard. Double agents within British ranks provided patriots with most valuable intelligence, reporting plans before they were executed, and sometimes sabotaging operations from within by providing false information to British commanders or delaying orders until opportunities passed. These traitors to the Crown risked execution if discovered, but believed that their espionage served higher loyalty to colonial rights and self-governance that British occupation threatened to extinguish forever through military force, that would reduce Americans to conquered subjects rather than free citizens governing themselves through consent. Printing presses were weapons more dangerous than cannon because ideas could not be suppressed by military force once they spread through population that had learned to read and debate political questions without deference to authorities, who claimed superior wisdom derived from birth or position rather than from reason and evidence that anyone could evaluate. Royal governors attempted to censor revolutionary publications by threatening printers with prosecution for seditious libel, revoking licenses that gave legal permission to operate presses, and occasionally destroying equipment of printers who defied warnings and continued publishing material that authorities considered dangerous to public order and imperial control. Underground presses operated throughout the pre-war period and during British occupation of major cities, hidden in basements and back rooms where patriot printers produced broadsides, pamphlets, and newspapers that circulated through networks of distributors who carried revolutionary literature to taverns, coffeehouses, churches, and private homes where colonists gathered to read and discuss ideas that transformed their understanding of legitimate government and their relationship to British authority. These clandestine publications kept revolutionary sentiment alive in occupied territories where British forces controlled streets but could not control minds or suppress ideas that spread through whispered conversations and secretly passed. Pamphlets that British patrols could never completely intercept despite their efforts. Isaiah Thomas fled Boston in April 1775, dismantling his press and smuggling it piece by piece past British sentries to Worcester, where he resumed publishing the Massachusetts Spy with articles so inflammatory that British authorities had tried repeatedly to shut him down while they controlled Boston's streets and could have arrested him if he had remained after. Lexington and Concord made all patriot printers targets for British retaliation. His narrow escape demonstrated both British determination to suppress revolutionary publications and the printers' commitment to continue their work despite personal danger, because they understood that print culture was the Cardi's, revolution's lifeblood, the medium through which ideas spread faster than any army could march and penetrated deeper than any military occupation could reach. Broadside printing made revolutionary ideas accessible to colonists who lacked money to purchase books or education to read complex philosophical treatises, presenting arguments in single-sheet formats that could be posted on tavern walls, read aloud in public squares, or passed hand to hand until they disintegrated from handling, while the ideas they contained lived on in conversations and commitments that transformed passive subjects into active citizens, demanding rights that British authorities insisted belonged only to Parliament to grant or withhold at its discretion, rather than inhering in human nature itself, regardless of what any government acknowledged. Before Americans could fight for independence, they had to argue their way to intellectual certainty that rebellion was justified by principles more fundamental than parliamentary statute or royal prerogative, natural law and social contract theory that placed legitimate government on foundations of reason and consent rather than tradition and force. The lawyers and philosophers who built this intellectual framework rarely fired muskets but provided revolutionary movement with philosophical artillery that made independence seem not just politically expedient but morally necessary for any people who took seriously Enlightenment principles about human dignity and rights that British tradition itself had developed but now refused to honour in colonial context. James Wilson argued with relentless logical precision that parliamentary sovereignty over colonies had no foundation in British constitutional history or legal precedent, that colonies owed allegiance directly to the Crown rather than to Parliament, and that therefore parliamentary legislation affecting America without colonial consent violated the very constitutional principles that made British government legitimate in British eyes. His pamphlet, Considerations on the Nature and Extent of the Legislative Authority of the British Parliament, constructed an argument so sophisticated and legally grounded that even opponents had to engage with it seriously, rather than dismissing it as ignorant colonial complaining about taxes. Wilson's reasoning provided intellectual foundation for position that colonists could remain loyal to King George while rejecting parliamentary authority, a distinction that made sense constitutionally, even if it proved politically impossible to maintain once fighting began. John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania circulated throughout colonies in 1767 and 1768, explaining in accessible prose why townshend duties violated colonial rights, even though they were external taxes on trade rather than internal taxes, like the Stamp Act that Parliament had already repealed under colonial pressure. Dickinson argued that any tax imposed for revenue rather than trade regulation was unconstitutional regardless of its form, establishing principle that Parliament could regulate colonial commerce but could not tax colonists for purposes of raising money without their consent through their own elected assemblies. His careful distinction between legitimate regulation and illegitimate taxation gave moderate colonists intellectual framework for opposing British policy without immediately embracing independence or rejecting all parliamentary authority over American affairs. These lawyer-philosophers built arguments brick by logical brick, citing precedent and principle to demonstrate that colonial resistance was conservative rather than radical, that patriots were defending traditional British liberties against parliamentary innovation that threatened rights Englishmen had secured through centuries of struggle against arbitrary power. Whether exercised by Stuart kings or Hanoverian, parliaments that forgot constitutional limits in their enthusiasm for asserting sovereignty that knew no bounds except those they chose to recognise. Diplomacy began before independence was declared, with unofficial envoys travelling to Europe, seeking support from powers that might see advantage in British difficulties with colonies that represented significant portion of imperial trade and military strength. Silas Deane arrived in France in July 1776 as Congress's secret agent, tasked with purchasing military supplies and sounding out French willingness to support American rebellion openly or covertly. Understanding that colonial forces could not sustain war against British military power without foreign assistance that would provide money, weapons, and eventually direct military intervention that could match British naval supremacy and global reach. Arthur Lee joined Deane in Paris as part of diplomatic commission that would eventually include Benjamin Franklin, forming team that negotiated French alliance while managing complex personalities and political intrigues that characterized European diplomacy, where personal relationships and secret negotiations determined outcomes as much as formal treaties and official declarations. Lee distrusted Deane, suspecting him of corruption and self-dealing in contracts for military supplies, creating internal divisions within American diplomatic mission that weakened its effectiveness and distracted from primary goal of securing French commitment to American independence before Britain could crush rebellion militarily, negotiate settlement that would restore colonial submission to imperial authority. French sympathizers like Pierre Beaumarchais, author and playwright who operated front company called Rodrigue Hortalez to funnel French government money and supplies to American forces while maintaining fiction of private commercial transactions that allowed France to assist rebellion without openly violating neutrality or provoking premature war with Britain before France was ready for military confrontation. Beaumarchais believed genuinely in American cause and in opportunity, that colonial rebellion presented for France to weaken its perpetual rival Britain, combining idealistic support for liberty with calculating pursuit of French national interest in ways that made him perfect intermediary between American diplomats and French ministers who wanted to help rebellion but needed plausible deniability until circumstances favored open intervention. These quiet diplomats worked in shadows of European courts and coffeehouses, building relationships and negotiating arrangements that would eventually bring French military power into war on American side at crucial moment when Washington's army might otherwise have collapsed from exhaustion and British forces might have restored imperial control over provinces that had briefly enjoyed independence, before learning that rebellion without foreign support was suicide against power that commanded world's strongest navy and could deploy professional armies that colonial militias could not defeat in conventional warfare that British generals assumed would decide the conflict quickly in Britain's favour. The Revolution's most profound contradiction was that a war fought for proposition that all men were created equal with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was prosecuted by armies that included enslaved people and free black men whose own rights were neither acknowledged nor secured by independence that claimed universal principles while practicing racial subjugation. Enslaved workers grew food, built fortifications, drove wagons, and performed countless other tasks that supported both British and American forces, their labor conscripted by whichever side controlled the territory where they lived and worked, their choices limited to serving masters who promised freedom or serving masters who did not, neither option offering genuine liberty but only different forms of exploitation. Prince Whipple crossed the Delaware with Washington on that desperate Christmas night in 1776, when the Continental Army struck at Trenton in surprise attack that revived revolutionary cause after months of defeats had brought independence to edge of collapse. Whipple rowed Washington's boat through ice-choked river but remained enslaved despite his service, fighting for American independence while denied the freedom that independence supposedly secured for all men, living embodiment of hypocrisy that founders like Jefferson recognized but could not or would not resolve through policies that would have freed enslaved people whose contributions made independence possible. James Armistead Lafayette served as spy for Marquis de Lafayette during Virginia campaigns, infiltrating British headquarters under cover of being escaped slave, seeking British protection in exchange for intelligence about American movements, actually feeding British false information while reporting their plans to Lafayette's headquarters. His espionage contributed significantly to American victory at Yorktown by keeping Lafayette informed about Cornwallis's decisions and movements, yet Armistead remained enslaved after the war, until Lafayette personally lobbied Virginia legislature for his freedom, highlighting that military service and significant contribution to revolutionary cause did not automatically secure freedom for enslaved patriots, whose sacrifices exceeded those of many white citizens who never risked anything comparable. The Revolution created space for anti-slavery arguments by making universal rights discourse central to American political identity, even though founders lacked courage or political will to extend those principles consistently to enslaved people whose bondage mocked every word of the Declaration they fought to defend. This contradiction would haunt American history for next century, creating moral and political crisis that would require another war to partially resolve, and generations more to begin addressing seriously through civil rights movements that invoked revolutionary principles that founders proclaimed, but incompletely honored. Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration contained passage condemning King George for forcing slave trade on unwilling colonies, blaming monarchy for institution that colonial legislatures and merchants had enthusiastically embraced and profited from for over a century, demonstrating that even revolutionary moment could not escape founders' need to deflect responsibility for slavery onto external forces, rather than acknowledging complicity in system they helped maintain. The Continental Congress deleted this passage at insistence of South Carolina and Georgia delegates, who refused to support independence if it criticized slavery, and Northern delegates who understood that forcing the issue would fragment revolutionary coalition before independence could be declared. The compromise revealed limits of revolutionary principles when they conflicted with economic interests and political necessities of maintaining unity among colonies with different labor systems and different investments in racial coming and subjugation. John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston served with Jefferson and Franklin on the committee charged with drafting Declaration, though Jefferson did most actual writing, and committee's role was primarily editorial, tightening language, removing passages that seemed too inflammatory or too specific, and ensuring that final document would command support from all colonies represented in Congress despite their divergent interests and concerns. Adams pushed for stronger language, asserting independence as fait accompli rather than aspiration, understanding that half-hearted declaration would undermine revolutionary cause by suggesting that colonists themselves doubted wisdom or justice of separation. They were proclaiming to world and to populations within colonies who would have to choose whether to support or oppose independence once it was formally declared. Jefferson's enslaved assistant, whose name history did not preserve, but whose labor made Jefferson's intellectual work possible, copied drafts by candlelight in Philadelphia boarding house, where Jefferson refined language that would proclaim universal human equality, while the person copying those words remained property of the man writing them. This anonymous figure's contribution to Declaration represents hundreds of similar contributions by enslaved people whose labor supported revolutionary cause, while they themselves were excluded from liberty it promised. creating foundation of independence through work that received no recognition and generated no freedom for those who performed it. The editing process transformed Jefferson's sometimes florid prose into sharper, more concise argument that built methodically from self-evident principles to catalogue of grievances to logical conclusion that colonies must become independent states, creating document whose rhetorical power derived partly from its structure and partly from its bold assertion of universal principles that transcended immediate political circumstances to articulate vision of legitimate government that would inspire revolutionary movements for centuries after American independence was secure, and founders who wrote declaration had passed into history that would celebrate their words while struggling to realize their implications fully. The Continental Congress nearly collapsed multiple times during summer of 1776 as delegates from northern commercial colonies, southern plantation provinces, and middle colonies with mixed economies argued over questions of representation, taxation, and authority that would determine what kind of union independent states would form if independence could be achieved. Small colonies demanded equal representation with large ones, fearing domination by Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania if voting power reflected population or wealth. Large colonies insisted that states with more people and greater resources should exercise proportionate influence in whatever confederation emerged from independence, arguing that equality among unequal entities was absurdity that would paralyze decision-making and reward small provinces for their smallness rather than their contributions to common cause. Southern delegates refused to accept any arrangement that threatened slavery or counted enslaved people as population for purposes of taxation, without also counting them for representation, creating the 3/5 Compromise's predecessor, as delegates struggled to reconcile incompatible positions about whether enslaved people were persons or property, depending on which classification served political interests of colonies, debating how to structure relationship between independent states that shared revolutionary cause but disagreed about almost everything else. Northern delegates objected to giving southern colonies increased representation based on enslaved populations, who were denied all rights and had no voice in governments that would supposedly represent them. Understanding that compromise on this issue would embed slavery protection into structure of new nation, even while declaring universal equality as founding principle. Regional suspicions threatened to fragment Congress as delegates from different sections eyed each other with distrust, born of economic competition and cultural differences that colonists had previously contained within imperial framework, but now had to negotiate directly without British authority mediating between provincial interests. New England merchants distrusted Southern planters' agrarian vision. Southern planters feared Northern commercial interests would dominate Confederation to their disadvantage. Middle colony delegates tried to broker compromises, while pursuing their own interests in whatever arrangement eventually emerged from debates that sometimes seemed more likely to produce 13 separate nations than one united republic, capable of defending independence against British power that remained formidable despite colonists' success in declaring separation. Backroom negotiations saved Congress when public debates reached impasses that threatened to deadlock independence movement before it could properly begin, with informal conversations over dinner and drinks, allowing delegates to explore compromises that would have been politically impossible to propose in formal sessions where every word was recorded and delegates had to maintain public positions that their colonies expected them to defend. These private discussions created space for flexibility and pragmatism that made unity possible, despite genuine disagreements about fundamental questions of governance that would continue troubling American politics long after independence was won, and founders had to fulfill promises they made in Philadelphia during that dangerous summer when revolution's success remained uncertain, and failure would have meant harsh punishment for everyone who had supported separation from empire that still claimed them as rebellious subjects rather than foreign enemies entitled to consideration under laws of war. The Declaration of Independence required physical infrastructure that historians rarely mention. Paper mills producing parchment of sufficient quality to receive the most important political document of the century, ink manufacturers supplying black liquid that would remain legible for ages, type foundries casting letters that printers would arrange into broadsides, announcing independence to populations throughout colonies, and furniture makers constructing tables where delegates would sign their names to document that would make them all traitors in British law if the revolution failed and Britain successfully prosecuted them for treason against legitimate authority of Crown. Philadelphia's artisans understood their role in revolution, even when that role seemed mundane compared to battlefield heroics or diplomatic negotiations that would determine whether independence survived its declaration to become political reality, recognized by world powers whose acceptance would transform American rebellion from illegal insurrection into legitimate war between sovereign nations. Papermakers worked overtime, producing sheets of sufficient size and quality to receive engrossed copy of declaration that Timothy Matlack would inscribe with elegant penmanship that made document not just legally binding but visually impressive artifact worthy of its historical significance. Their labor was skilled craft, requiring knowledge passed through apprenticeship over years of training in techniques for turning rags into writing surface smooth enough for precise calligraphy. Printers needed constant supplies of metal type, replacement letters for those that broke or wore down from repeated use in producing newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides that spread revolutionary ideas throughout colonies and eventually announced independence itself to populations who would learn of Congress's decision through printed copies, distributed to every town and posted in every public square. Type foundries operated by craftsmen who understood metallurgy and possessed precision necessary to cast letters that would lock together in forms capable of producing thousands of impressions without degradation that would make text illegible. Without these foundries, revolutionary press could not have functioned at scale necessary to create political movement that united 13 colonies in resistance to British authority. Furniture makers supplied Congress with chairs, tables, desks, and other furnishings that made Independence Hall functional workspace, rather than empty chamber. Their craftsmanship visible in every photograph, tourists take of room where independence was declared, and Constitution would later be drafted. These artisans rarely thought of themselves as revolutionaries, but they enabled revolution through practical work that created physical environment where political transformation could occur, proving that nations are built not just by leaders making momentous decisions, but by craftsmen making tables solid enough to hold documents, while delegates sign them, and chairs comfortable enough to allow extended debates where ideas contend with ideas until consensus emerges, or majority forces decision that minority accepts. Because alternative to unity is defeat and submission to authority, they have collectively rejected. Revolution required armed defenders even during debates about whether independence should be declared, because Philadelphia in summer of 1776 was surrounded by British forces, infiltrated by loyalist spies, and vulnerable to raid that could have captured entire Continental Congress and ended American independence before it was formally proclaimed. Militia units and volunteer companies guarded approaches to city, patrolled streets watching for suspicious persons who might be gathering intelligence for British commanders, planning operations against revolutionary leadership, and provided visible demonstration that patriots controlled Philadelphia and could defend delegates meeting to decide colonies' future against empire that considered them all traitors, subject to arrest and execution for treason. These guardians were mostly ordinary citizens who had volunteered for militia service or joined ad hoc companies formed specifically to protect Congress during this dangerous period, when British forces might strike at any moment to fight, decapitate, revolutionary movement by capturing its leadership before independence could be declared, and international recognition sought from European powers, whose support would transform rebellion into war between nations governed by laws that protected combatants from treatment as criminals, subject to summary execution. The militia took their duties seriously, despite limited training and equipment, understanding that failure to protect Congress would doom independence cause before it properly began and subject them personally to British retaliation for their role in rebellion against legitimate authority that Crown claimed over all British subjects, regardless of where they resided. Sentries stood watch outside Independence Hall during debates over independence, preventing entry by anyone not authorized to attend deliberations that had to remain confidential until Congress was ready to announce its decision publicly through carefully managed communications that would explain reasoning behind independence and justify separation to domestic and international audiences, whose support or opposition would determine whether American Revolution succeeded or collapsed into failed rebellion crushed by British military power. These sentries were revolution's first line of defense, ordinary men performing unglamorous duty that made historic debates possible by ensuring delegates could deliberate without fear of immediate arrest or assassination by British agents or loyalist fanatics who might have attempted to prevent independence through violence aimed at revolutionary leadership. The silent guardians received little recognition then and less now, their names mostly unrecorded in histories that focus on delegates' speeches and votes rather than on militia service that protected those delegates and made their work possible. But without these volunteers standing watch through long summer days and nights, prepared to defend Congress against threats that might materialize at any moment, independence might never have been declared, because delegates might have been captured or intimidated into abandoning plans for separation before they could complete their work and announce decision that would transform 13 British colonies into independent states, claiming sovereignty and recognition as legitimate nation rather than rebellious provinces subject to punishment. Once British military superiority reasserted control that colonists had temporarily escaped, through coordinated resistance that British power could crush if given opportunity, is less than #0. 9#. The Declaration of Independence was written for elites, but spoke to ordinary people through language that transcended class barriers and educational levels, making complex constitutional arguments accessible through plain prose that explained why separation was necessary in terms that anyone could understand regardless of their familiarity with political philosophy or legal precedent. The document's power lay partly in its rhetorical sophistication, but also in its adaptability to different audiences and different modes of communication, from formal readings by educated gentlemen to informal discussions in taverns where working men debated its implications over ale, and from pulpit sermons that framed independence in religious terms to songs that turned political argument into popular entertainment. Ministers throughout colonies preached sermons interpreting independence through biblical frameworks that gave revolutionary cause, divine sanction, and moral authority that political arguments alone could not provide to populations for whom religious conviction shaped understanding of justice and legitimate resistance to tyranny. These election sermons and fast-day addresses placed American independence within sacred history, comparing colonists to Israelites escaping Egyptian bondage and British tyranny to Pharaoh's oppression, that God condemned and ultimately destroyed through miraculous intervention on behalf of chosen people seeking freedom from unjust authority. Religious interpretation made independence seem not just politically expedient but spiritually required, duty that Christians owed to God who had created humans free and condemned governments that reduced free people to slavery through arbitrary power exercised without consent. Songs carried Declaration's message to illiterate citizens who could not read printed broadsides, but could learn verses, set to familiar tunes and sing them, while working or drinking or marching with militia companies preparing to defend independence against British forces that would surely attempt to suppress rebellion through military campaigns designed to restore imperial control before independence could be secured through military victory or diplomatic recognition. These songs simplified complex arguments into memorable phrases and catchy melodies that spread ideas through oral culture that reached populations beyond print culture's scope, making revolution participatory cultural movement rather than merely political decision by colonial elites acting without popular support or understanding. Public readings brought Declaration to town squares and church steps throughout colonies during July and August 1776, with local officials or prominent citizens reading entire document aloud to assembled crowds who cheered phrases about self-evident truths and unalienable rights, while listening soberly to catalogue of grievances that justified separation they might previously have opposed or doubted. These readings made independence real for ordinary people by taking words from parchment signed in Philadelphia and embedding them in local communities through public performance that invited collective participation in revolutionary moment, transforming spectators into actors in historical drama whose outcome remained uncertain but whose significance everyone grasped regardless of their education or sophistication about political theory and constitutional law. Mary Catherine Goddard operated the Maryland Journal from Baltimore print shop that became central node in revolutionary communications network, publishing news from other colonies alongside local reports and commentary that shaped how Maryland readers understood the escalating conflict with Britain. When Congress needed printer to produce official broadside copies of the Declaration with all 56 signers' names attached, they chose Goddard despite risks that such commission entailed for printer, who would be easily identified as having published treasonous document that British authorities would certainly seek to suppress by destroying press and imprisoning. Printer as warning to others who might consider publishing revolutionary materials. The decision to print signers' names represented calculated risk by Congress and by Goddard because previous broadside copies had listed colonies but not individual delegates who voted for independence, providing some protection through anonymity that publication of names would eliminate. British forces occupying American cities could use this information to identify revolutionary leaders for targeted arrest and prosecution as traitors, making printed list with all names effectively a wanted poster that British authorities could employ in hunting patriot leadership. Goddard understood these risks but accepted commission anyway, demonstrating courage that matched any battlefield heroism, though her contribution involved operating press rather than shouldering musket. Her press worked through January 1777, producing copies on paper that proclaimed independence and listed every delegate who had signed Declaration in Philadelphia 6 months earlier, creating permanent public record of who had committed themselves to revolutionary cause in ways that made retreat impossible and failure potentially fatal. The physical act of printing required skill and endurance, as each sheet had to be carefully aligned in press, inked evenly, impressed with proper pressure to transfer text without smearing, and then removed and set aside to dry before next sheet could be printed. Large print runs demanded hours of repetitive labor by printer, who understood that mistakes would waste expensive paper and delay completion of commission that Congress wanted fulfilled quickly so that copies could circulate throughout colonies and beyond to foreign courts, where American diplomats sought recognition. Goddard's printed declaration made independence visible and permanent in ways that mere announcement could not achieve, transforming political decision into material artifact that could circulate, be preserved, and serve as tangible evidence of revolutionary commitment that words alone could not provide. Her courage in accepting this commission, knowing the risks and her skill in executing it despite technical challenges, made her essential contributor to revolution's success, proving that nations require not just leaders who make decisions and soldiers who fight battles, but also craftspeople who possess skills and courage to create infrastructure that makes political transformation materially real and permanent, rather than merely rhetorical gesture that leaves no lasting mark on world, that continues after revolutionary moment passes and new challenges emerge. The American Revolution succeeded because thousands of people whose names history never recorded believed in principles articulated in declaration and acted on those beliefs through countless small decisions that collectively made independence possible, defendable, and ultimately successful against British power that should have crushed colonial rebellion before it could establish itself as legitimate movement, worthy of recognition by European powers whose support would prove decisive. These unnamed thousands produced food that fed armies, gathered intelligence that informed strategy, transported supplies that sustained campaigns, nursed wounded who might otherwise have died, and maintained farms and businesses that kept colonial economy functioning during years when ordinary commerce was disrupted by war and uncertainty about whether independence would survive long enough to become established fact rather than failed experiment. Historians naturally focus on leaders who made momentous decisions and generals who commanded armies in battles that determined outcomes of campaigns, But these leaders and generals could accomplish nothing without support from populations who chose to follow their leadership and provide resources necessary for organized resistance against imperial power that possessed overwhelming advantages in military capacity, financial resources, and international legitimacy that rebellion lacked until France recognized American independence and committed to supporting it with money, weapons, and eventually direct military intervention that made British victory unlikely and American success achievable. The relationship between leaders and followers was reciprocal rather than hierarchical, with leaders depending on continued popular support for legitimacy and resources, while followers depended on leaders to coordinate resistance and pursue strategies that might achieve independence without causing social collapse or British retaliation so harsh that submission seemed preferable to continued fighting. The Declaration endures not merely because it articulated powerful principles about human equality and natural rights, but because those principles inspired generations of Americans and people worldwide to struggle for liberty and self-governance against systems that denied them voice in their own government and treated them as subjects to be ruled, rather than citizens whose consent made government legitimate. The words Jefferson wrote and Congress approved in Philadelphia during summer of 1776 transcended their immediate purpose of justifying separation from Britain to become aspirational statement of universal principles that even United States itself has struggled to honor fully in practice, creating permanent tension between American ideals and American reality that has driven social movements from abolition through civil rights to contemporary struggles for equal treatment and recognition of human dignity regardless of race, gender, or other characteristics that have historically determined who enjoyed rights that Declaration proclaimed universal. Nations are built by millions of individual decisions to support or oppose, to risk or retreat, to contribute or conserve, made by ordinary people facing circumstances beyond their control, but choosing nonetheless how they will respond to historical moment that demands something from them, even when they never sought to participate in revolutionary transformation. The revolution succeeded because enough people made enough decisions in favor of independence and against submission, not from certainty about outcome, but from commitment to principles and hope for future that seemed worth risking everything to achieve, creating legacy that belongs not just to men who signed Declaration, but to everyone who made their signatures meaningful through actions that transformed words on parchment into political reality that endured beyond revolutionary generation. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.